helped my sick neighbor, but her daughter was suspicious. There's a little shop 2 blocks from my house, one of those old-fashioned places that seem frozen in time. The walls are lined with shelves that bow under the weight of canned goods, dusty cereal boxes, and off-brand snacks that no one ever seems to buy. A small refrigerator hums in the back, its glass door fogged up from years of condensation. The linoleum floor is cracked, the fluorescent lights flicker, and the air always carries a faint scent of stale bread and warm plastic. It's not the kind of place I need to shop. I can get everything cheaper and fresher at the supermarket across town. But I keep coming back. The real reason I go is Eleanor Harper. She's run the store for as long as I've lived in town, maybe longer. She's about 65, but her spirit feels younger despite the wear and tear of the years. She moves deliberately, not in the way of someone slowing down, but like someone savoring the motion itself. She has a smile that softens even the hardest days, a voice that soothes like an old song. She greets every customer by name, asks about their lives, remembers their troubles. She forgives small debts, waves off those who come up short, acts as if generosity is a natural part of the transaction. I don't need anything when I go in, but I always buy something. A pack of gum, a bottle of water, a newspaper I don't plan to read. It's just an excuse to stop by, to check in, to be in her presence for a few minutes. She's one of the few constants in a town where everything else seems to be changing, closing, or fading away. I don't know much about her personal life. She's never mentioned a husband, and I've never seen a ring on her finger. She lives alone in a small white house a few streets over. I asked once if she had family, and she had simply smiled, her eyes distant. I have a daughter, she had said. She's busy. She calls sometimes. That was all she offered, and I didn't press her. Then one morning, I walked in, and Eleanor wasn't there. Instead, a younger woman stood behind the counter, her expression tight, her hands fidgeting with the register buttons. I hesitated at the threshold, the bell above the door still jingling in my ears, something about the scene feeling immediately wrong. Eleanor was always here, even on holidays, even in bad weather. I cleared my throat and asked where she was, and the woman's answer was short, clipped. She's taking a break. That wasn't right. Eleanor never took breaks. Days passed, and still she didn't return. I kept coming back, asking, hoping, but it was always the same woman, the same vague response. 2 weeks went by before I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling anymore. Something had to be wrong. I knew where she lived. I had passed by her house enough times to recognize the wind chimes on her porch, the way the paint peeled at the edges of the windows. That evening, I stopped by the store first, grabbing a bouquet of cheap grocery store flowers and a small box of chocolates. I didn't know if she'd even want them, but it felt better than showing up empty-handed. When I knocked, it took a long time before I heard the shuffle of slow footsteps. The door creaked open, and there she was, Eleanor, but not the Eleanor I knew. Her skin looked ashen, her eyes sunken, her usual warmth replaced with a dull, heavy exhaustion. She leaned on the doorframe like it was holding her up. The sight of her hit me like a punch to the gut. I stepped inside, looking around. The house was small but cozy, filled with the quiet remnants of a life lived alone. A single armchair sat by the window, a faded blanket draped over the back. Framed photographs lined the shelves, their glass slightly smudged, their colors fading. The sink held a few unwashed dishes. A stack of unopened mail rested on the table. The place was neat but neglected, as if it had been maintained just enough to keep from falling apart. She told me, in bits and pieces, what had happened. She hadn't been feeling well. The fatigue came first, then the dizziness. It had gotten worse, and she had no choice but to step away from the store for a while. She didn't want to be a burden, didn't want anyone fussing over her. That was Eleanor, always more worried about others than herself. She mentioned her daughter again, almost as an afterthought. Sarah. She lived in the city now, had her own life, rarely visited. She calls sometimes, Eleanor repeated, but the words felt emptier now, like she wasn't sure if they were still true. After that visit, I made a habit of stopping by more often. I'd bring little things, a bag of fresh fruit, a homemade meal, a book I thought she might like. Some days we'd talk, other days we'd just sit in comfortable silence. She never asked me to do any of it, but I could tell she appreciated it in the way she lingered in our conversations, in the way her eyes softened when she saw me at her door. Then, one evening, as I sat with Eleanor, there was a sharp knock at the door. I got up to answer, and when I opened it, I was met with a pair of familiar eyes. Sarah Harper. She was different than I remembered from school. Her hair was shorter, her clothes sleek and professional, her gaze sharp and suspicious. She looked past me, her expression darkening when she saw her mother in the chair behind me. That's when the accusations started. She barely looked at me as she spoke, her words sharp as knives, slicing through the air with absolute certainty. She assumed she knew everything, why I was here, what I wanted. In her eyes, I was nothing more than a leech, circling a vulnerable woman, waiting for the moment to claim something that was never mine. She spoke of people like me, of the horror stories she'd heard. She had convinced herself before she even walked through the door. I had no defense because I never expected to need one. The idea of benefiting from Eleanor's kindness had never once crossed my mind. I had done this because she needed someone, because she had no one else. And yet, in Sarah's eyes, I was a vulture, a schemer, a fraud. I wanted to argue, to make her understand, but I saw the exhaustion on Eleanor's face, the sadness in her eyes, and I knew it wasn't the time. Without another word, I turned and left, stepping out into the cool night, the door closing behind me. I had only wanted to help, but sometimes kindness is mistaken for something else entirely, and there was nothing I could do to change that. I left Eleanor's house that night with an ache in my chest, one I couldn't quite place. Sarah's accusations had been sharp, cutting through my goodwill like a blade, but what haunted me most was the look in Eleanor's eyes, the quiet resignation, the exhaustion, as if she had seen this before, lived it before. Perhaps she had. Despite Sarah's hostility, I couldn't stay away. Eleanor still wasn't well. I could see it in the way her strength waned with each visit, in the way her voice grew thinner, her laughter softer, almost as if she were slipping away piece by piece. I kept bringing small comforts, a warm blanket, a book she might enjoy, a fresh loaf of bread. She never asked for anything, never wanted to be a burden, but gratitude shone in her eyes when I set something down on her table without a word. Then one morning I heard the news. Eleanor had been taken to the hospital. My stomach twisted at the thought of her in some stark, sterile room, surrounded by beeping machines, alone. Couldn't ignore it. I had to see her. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and stale air, the kind of place where time drags its feet. I found my way to her ward, hesitating only briefly before pushing the door open. There she was, lying in bed, frail against the crisp white sheets. Her skin had paled, the deep warmth in her face now replaced with an unsettling translucency. But when she turned her head and saw me, a small smile pulled at the corners of her lips. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. She looked so tired, so much smaller than I remembered. I sat beside her, my hands folded together, searching for words. Words of comfort, words of support. Anything to let her know she wasn't alone. I told her she was strong. I told her she would get through this. And every word was genuine, even if I wasn't sure I believed them myself. We sat like that for 10 minutes, our conversation weaving through small memories and gentle reassurances, until the door swung open. Sarah. She entered with a doctor in tow, her expression instantly hardening when she saw me. She didn't need to say anything. Her glare spoke louder than words. It was the same look she had given me that night at Eleanor's house, but now it was heavier, filled with something darker. Suspicion. Disgust. A certainty that I was there for all the wrong reasons. I watched her eyes dart to her mother, then back to me, as if she were scanning for evidence of betrayal. In her mind, I had already won Eleanor's favor. In her mind, I had already stolen something from her. The doctor spoke in a calm, clinical tone. Eleanor's condition was stable, but she needed to remain under observation. I barely registered the words, too aware of Sarah standing just feet away, barely containing the fury beneath her skin. The doctor left soon after, and then Sarah turned to me. She asked me to step outside. The air in the hospital courtyard was cool against my skin, but there was no relief to be found in it. Sarah faced me, arms crossed, her entire posture rigid with tension. And then, in a voice low and sharp, she told me exactly what she thought of me. She accused me of preying on her mother's kindness, of waiting for the inevitable moment when Eleanor would change her will, when she would sign away everything she owned to a man who had been nothing more than a stranger to their family. She said she would not allow it, that if, for even a second, I thought I could take what wasn't mine, she would drag me into court, tear apart my reputation, make sure the world knew exactly what kind of fraud I was. I wanted to protest, to tell her how wrong she was, but I saw the fire in her eyes. There was no reasoning with her, no convincing her of my intentions. So I did the only thing I could do. I left. I walked out of that hospital feeling hollow, the weight of her words pressing against my ribs. I told myself I had done what I could, that I had no right to interfere anymore, that Eleanor had family, and whether or not they cared for her in the way she deserved, it wasn't my place to fight them. 2 days later, I heard the news. Eleanor was gone. It happened in the quiet of the night, in the sterile hush of that hospital room, with no one by her side. I imagined her lying there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for a visitor who never came. I imagined the beep of the machines, the fluorescent lights buzzing above her, the loneliness stretching out around her like a shadow. And then I imagined the moment the silence took over, when the machines stopped beeping, when there was nothing left but stillness. I don't know how long I sat in my car after I heard. Minutes, hours, it didn't matter. My hands trembled against the steering wheel, my throat tightened, and then, without warning, the tears came. I cried for her, for the woman who had given so much to so many and received so little in return, for the kindness she had offered freely, the warmth she had spread so effortlessly, for the loneliness she must have felt in her final moments, for the fact that she had left this world with her daughter fighting over property, while the only person who had truly cared for her had been cast aside like a thief in the night. I had lost someone, and the world, whether it knew it or not, had lost someone too. The day of Eleanor's funeral arrived with an overcast sky, the kind that seemed to press down on the earth, heavy and unmoving. The small chapel where the service was held was overflowing with people. Neighbors, customers from her little shop, old friends, even strangers who had only met her in passing. So many had come to say goodbye. It was a testament to the kind of person she had been, the quiet impact she had made on people's lives. I stood at the back for a while, watching, listening. There was a warmth in the room, despite the sorrow. Murmured memories, hushed voices recounting kindnesses, small moments that had stayed with them. A woman spoke about how Eleanor had once covered the cost of her groceries when she had nothing. An elderly man wiped his eyes as he recalled how Eleanor had given him a place to sit and rest in her shop every afternoon when his legs could no longer carry him far. She had lived a simple life, but a meaningful one. And now, in death, she had brought all these people together, woven them into the same moment of remembrance. I stepped forward, finally. I moved through the crowd toward the front, toward her. The coffin was open. They had dressed her in soft blues, the color of the sky before dusk, the color of quiet endings. Her face was peaceful, but it was not her. The Eleanor I knew was warmth and movement, not this still, painted thing. But this was all that was left now. I stood there for a moment, my thoughts drifting between sorrow and gratitude. I didn't speak. I didn't pray. I only stood, remembering her as she had been, before turning to leave. And that's when I saw Sarah. She was watching me, her expression unreadable but still sharp, still cold. She had expected me to stay away, maybe even wanted it. But I had come despite everything, despite her accusations, despite her cruelty. Because this wasn't about her. This was about Eleanor. Her gaze held no apology. Even now, even in the face of undeniable truth, she saw a competitor. She knew now that I was never in the will. She knew now that her paranoia had been misplaced. But instead of regret, there was only a deeper resentment, a final, unspoken decision that whatever string had once connected us was now severed completely. She turned and walked away without a word. No acknowledgement, no remorse. Just distance widening with each step. I left the chapel feeling heavier than when I had arrived. It wasn't just grief weighing me down. It was something else, something colder, something bitter. Eleanor had been a light in the world, and yet the people closest to her had let shadows take root in her absence. Greed, suspicion, cruelty. Sarah had lost her mother, but it seemed she hadn't mourned for her. She had been waiting, watching, calculating. And now, with Eleanor gone, she had nothing left to fight against but ghosts of her own making. I had lost someone dear, and yet, in a way, I felt as if I had lost something else too. Something I couldn't quite name. Something I wasn't sure I'd ever get back.